Hi and welcome. I'm Beth, and today I want to share with you a new sewing pattern I've created and show you how to sew it as well. I've made some of these before, but usually for larger sizes. They're mannequins or dress forms, and I've made them for the classic smart doll, for the pear-sized smart doll, and for the male smart doll. But today it's time for the Blythe doll. Much smaller and more difficult to get accurate, but it was much requested and I was up for the challenge. I began the process in the way I usually do and covered one of my Blythe dolls in cling film and in a layer of masking tape. It did take me a couple goes to get the seam lines that I wanted just right, but once I did, I cut apart the masking tape templates and traced them onto a lightweight card. I measured the bust, waist and hip measurements of the Blythe doll body. I was using the A-zone jointed doll for this, and I broke down the different measurements per panel needed to get the exact right size in the end. I'm going to make this pattern available on my shop at bethramsden.com and at no additional cost to paid supporters over on Patreon. Interfacing will be an important part of this project, and hopefully you can tell how firm the iron-on interfacing I've selected here is. I'm going to demonstrate two different ways to use the interfacing, the first of which will be to trace the template, including its seam allowance, directly onto the interfacing. The fusible interfacing has no grain of its own, so you can just arrange and cut out the pieces however you like to minimize wastage. I recommend a medium or lightweight cotton for the outside of the dress form, which does have a grain, so you'll want to arrange the template pieces accordingly. Once ironed on, I have a copy of the templates without their seam allowance, which I then place and trace around. I use a heat erasable pen to make these lines, and once done it's simple enough to cut out all the pieces just following the outline of the interfacing. The alternative method I mentioned earlier is essentially tracing the outline onto the interfacing of only the version without seam allowance. Once pressed onto the cotton, I then manually add on the seam allowance afterwards. Here I'm just cutting out the alignment marks before pressing the interfacing to the cotton because any pen marks would vanish. And here I'm pressing the interfacing onto my cotton, arranging them so there's enough space between each piece for the seam allowance. I can then go in with my heat erasable pen and a ruler and I can measure and mark my seam allowance, which can be whichever size you choose. I've gone for 5mm. Here my pieces are done, although you'll also have a base piece. It's just that I hadn't patterned it out yet at this point. The construction is the same whether you've got interfacing on your seam allowance or not. We're going to fold the main piece right sides in at the shoulder and start by stitching by hand or by machine the two shoulder darts. I have hand stitched mine here and then I finger press them both towards the back. I've designed this mannequin to have a slightly longer shoulder than my previous designs. We're then going to grab one of the side pieces and match the alignment marks with the front to the front side, also matching and pinning the bottoms of the seam allowance and the back to the back side. Match these with pins to begin with and make small cuts into the seam allowance where needed to help ease the curves. You can then either add more pins or a basting stitch to hold the seam together before taking it to the machine to finish off, or do as I did here and just carefully match up the seams front and back and use a strong hand stitch. I used a back stitch here to sew them together. I made shallow cuts into the seam allowance anywhere there were curves, which really helped with shaping things. Here I've just sewn up to the first marker so far and will continue around the front and over the shoulder and down the back. I did this on my first try making this mannequin, but I actually found it was easier to sew from the lower hem up to the front waist marker and then tie off my thread and then start again from the back side hem and stitch up to the waist marker before then continuing to sew the side around the shoulder and the curve of the bust. Here, that first side piece is fully sewn in, and you can see I've fully cut notches out of the seam allowance over the shoulder to help ease that curve in. And then I'm finger pressing the seam allowance outwards away from the side. You could try and press this with a small iron if you're able to. And then we're going to repeat the same steps with the other side piece. Here I'm just showing what I mentioned before, how I've stitched the lower half of the front and back before I stop and ease in the bust and shoulder curves, stitching all around them next. And for those making this version without the interfacing extending into the seam allowance, the steps are just the same. You might find it a little easier because your seam allowance will be a little softer and perhaps more pliable for the curved areas. Back to where we were, our mannequin dress form should look like this so far. And next we're going to insert the neck. I begin by making shallow cuts into the seam allowance of both the neck piece and around the neck on the main body. I'm then going to align these two pieces with right sides facing, starting at the center point, using a pin to match the neck and the main body center point. I then stitch outwards from that center, tie off my thread, and then come back and stitch the other side, again starting from that center point. I then finger press those seams down towards the body. Next we'll close the back seam, but before we do, we're going to fold down the seam allowance towards the inside, the wrong side, and either finger press or glue to hold it in place. Just make sure your edges are tucked down by the right amount so they line up, and repeat the same for the bottommost hem all the way around the base of the dress form. Again, glue or press or just hand press. Then with those edges secured, we're going to align the back seam right sides in with itself and stitch all the way up. Our dress form is now fully enclosed, only open at the top and the bottom. We can press open the seam allowance at the center back there, and we can now carefully turn the whole thing right side out. And if you didn't glue them before, just go back and make sure the seam allowance around the neck and the base of your mannequin are properly folded along their seam allowance lines. For this, the first mannequin I made, I hadn't yet cut out my neck and base pieces, so here I'm tracing that onto interfacing, and I'm going to cut on the line and leave an excess of cotton around the edge to gather in and stick down. I glued down my seam allowance for these, but you could just sew a running stitch around the outside of the extra seam allowance and pull it to gather it in. That would work very nicely as well. If you are going to glue it down, I recommend cutting slits into the seam allowance first. I made a real mess of this one. I did better later on though. You're going to need some toy or cushion stuffing to fill your mannequin with, and at this point just push some into the neck so you have something to press against. Hold your top neck piece in place and then simply whip stitch or ladder stitch all the way round to secure it in place. I've left the small amount of stuffing in the neck at the moment, but I'm going in with a slightly rounded tipped tool and I'm just making sure all of the seam allowances are pressed in the direction I want before I put in much more stuffing. Next, you're going to need some sort of pole or stick or dowel to act as your mannequin stand. You could have this longer and push it all the way up into the neck before adding stuffing around it. But I just had a shorter length available, so I stuffed the upper half of the mannequin and then held it in place while I added stuffing little by little around it, so it held it in place. On the base piece, you'll see the center is marked, and for mine, I've marked out a circle which matches the size of the dowel I'm using as my stand. I cut this out of my firm interfacing and press it onto cotton, same as with the neck piece, except this time, once I've pressed it down, I'm going to cut small slits into the seam allowance in the middle and press those pieces out and glue them down. I will then cut slits into the outer seam allowance and glue that down as well. Ah, redemption. Yes, much neater that time. So we're going to do the same as with the top neck piece, and we're going to slide it onto the dowel, right side facing out. You can hot glue it in place if you're worried that the dowel might slip out by accident, but once you do, you're just going to whip stitch or ladder stitch all the way around the outside again to secure it. While I finish that off, let me just say a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters and remind you that joining even just the petite tier gives you access to the patrons only secret shop, which has lots of free sewing patterns and files, some of which are exclusive to Patreon. Our mannequin is nearly finished, but there's one last piece of essential shaping to do. I'm going to mark a little point at the same place on each side. And what I'm going to do is take a needle and thread. I recommend doubling it over. Anchor my thread to one side and pass it through and back through and through again enough times that I can pull on the thread and cinch in the sides, just at the sides of the bust where the underarms would be. And this just helps give us that final bit of shaping to make our mannequin really match the Blythe body. You can use this kind of soft sculpture needle and thread technique to pull in the sides of the waist if needed as well. It can help if your measurements have turned out a little larger than wanted. In fact, for this first version of the mannequin that you've seen me make here, when I went to double check the measurements against the Blythe body, they were slightly too big, despite how precise I tried to be with my measurements, right down to the millimeter. They were still a little bigger than I wanted. So the version that you'll have when you download the pattern will actually be a slightly smaller one that I went and remade again. You'll see it at the end here. And it turned out to be perfect. The measurements were exactly what they should be. So at this point, your mannequin should look like the one on the right here. And if you want to double check, the measurements should be a 10 centimeter bust, 7 centimeter waist, and 10.5 centimeter hip measurement. I really try to be as precise as I can be at this scale of sewing, and for my finished mannequin I did also cinch in the waist. I anchored my thread at the centre back and moved kind of 1/4 at a time, bringing the thread out and back in at the side, the front, the other side, back to the back, and pulled it in before anchoring and knotting my thread. I think when we're working with a stuffed dress form like this, it's probably the easiest and best way to get the kind of accuracy that I would want from a sewing tool at this scale. Now we're going to finish off the base for the stand. I've got my wooden dowel at about the same height to match the height of the Blythe doll. I have a wooden slice here. My dowel is a little too wide for me to just straight up drill a hole into the base for, so what I do instead is drill a smaller hole and a matching hole into the bottom of the dowel, and then take a thick piece of wire and push it up into the dowel, and then with some glue to hold everything secure, I then push that wire like a pin down into the base. Of course, you can go crazy at this point, use whatever tools you have available, make a plastic one, reuse something that's heavy enough to act as a base. Just whatever works best for you. But with that, we have a finished tiny Blythe dress form. You can use it to help you design and draft outfits for your own dolls, or even just use it as a display stand for dresses and other clothes. I certainly hope you'll find it useful and will give it a try yourself. It's really not a difficult project to make, you just have to take your time with the curves, and of course you can hand sew it if that's your preference. Nice and easy. You'll find links in the description box below. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Leave a like if you did, that would be a great help, and I would love for you to leave me a comment as well. Just let me know what you thought of today's project. Are you going to give it a go? Do you like to use a dressmaking mannequin in your own process? Thank you, take care, and until next time, I'll see you later. Bye!